Hi there, and thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our podcast and have a recommendation about someone you think that we should have on to share their voice and journey with the world, by all means, let us know. It could be an aid worker, monastic, author, journalist, doctor, resistance leader, really anyone with some tie or another to the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To offer up a name, go to our website, insightmyanmar.org, and let us know. But for now, just sit back and take a listen to today's podcast. So I'm back here with our ongoing conversation with Jonathan Crowley, and we ended the last discussion. We were talking about two very different things, but we found a convergence in some of these themes. One was the theme that I was bringing about this observation I've had of a somewhat Orientalist outlook of meditators in general, and not just meditators, not just Goenka meditators, but even scholars and tourists and others that were coming with an Orientalist understanding of the country that was more something they wanted to find in their mind and in their fantasy for whatever purpose that served psychologically, rather than to really interact with the country and the people. And we were talking about it more specifically in terms of those coming for meditation, that uh, this Orientalist perspective I was arguing and I was seeing was more framing one's privilege and access and being able to practice the best technique, and the one that came from this exotic, almost movie landscape of how it reached you, and rather than interacting with what was really being presented in reality. You, on the other hand, were talking about your experiences investigating white privilege and racism, and other things of that nature within when you were a teacher in the Goenka organization. And I was suggesting, just as we ended the interview, that there could be a surprising convergence between these, that there is that both of these criticisms and concerns, when addressed, whether one was addressing that there was this greater history that went beyond how things were being described in discourses and in understanding among meditators in the Goenka tradition, and that there was this hesitancy or fear in taking on some of these issues and considerations, and really being curious about them. And then on your hand, that you definitely ran into a wall when you were trying to talk about making the courses more open and accessible to people of all backgrounds, and especially people of color and lower income. And one of the things I suggested in terms of the convergence of these two issues is that both of these concerns, were they to be addressed, were pointing to a lack of perfection with something, with the organization, the teacher, the teaching, the administration. That is left to be, that nuance is left to be discussed. But there's some imperfection that's being pointed to. Now, I don't see really a problem with an imperfection. I mean, how many things are perfect? I think that being able to point out that a concern with this could be better, or this one isn't really addressing this, or this is really isn't really set up in this way, or even like whenever one makes a decision, we're going to do things this way instead of that way. You're preferring one style than another. And often when you make a decision, just the nature of making a decision is that something has to be sacrificed or left out. This is just a normal run of things in life when you make decisions. And so we were expressing that in trying to bring about these concerns, it was pointing at a fact that there was something less than perfect with something about the organization of the courses, and that because this integral message was being developed, of this perfection, of this somewhat, whether it was the technique or the teacher or the some part of it, this perfection, that to honestly address one part that was not being as effective or running as it should be, there was no way for people on the inside really to hear that in a critical way without feeling that everything was under attack and everything was coming down. And so that really prevented honest discussions of any kind, whether one was talking about the something of the history in Myanmar, whether one was talking about equal opportunities, people of color, or any number of things, because these topics and conversations are questioning a lack of perfection overall, which is a conversation just simply not able to have. And there would be cognitive dissonance, or there would be minimizing, or avoidance, or something else, or there would just be a the ever present guidance to return to practice, which, as we've talked about, is very useful in some circumstances, and in others becomes an avoidance tactic itself. To say to return to practice is a way of saying we're even though the what's implied there is saying that practice is going to give greater answers, and this is a deeper way to understand this. In essence, it's also when things ultimately aren't being resolved. Sometimes things are resolved better through practice, but when things aren't being resolved, it's really a way to signify we're going to avoid this topic and do something where we don't have to talk or address this right now, or perhaps ever. And so that's kind of bringing us up to date on where we ended the last one, and adding a couple other thoughts to it. I've This has been a longer intro than I usually do with complex topics. I'll just turn it over to you and hear your reflections on that, as well as your memories of that last talk, and what stands out on your end.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Joe, for having me back and continuing this conversation. I really appreciate it. Um, yeah, I think the whole notion of just what can be questioned and what cannot be questioned in the tradition is very relevant. But I want to tell a story because I ended up being an assistant teacher for about well, from 2002, and then I took a break, but then up until about 2021, I guess. And what was fascinating to me, or and what became a little problematic was that in just our local assistant teacher meetings, as well as a lot of the national assistant teacher meetings, rarely were we actually like talking about the practice, or our own practices, or fleshing up concerns around that, or challenges, or even positive pieces or inspirations. Most of the time in our AT meetings, we were focusing on rules and regulations, and what needed to be refined further, or nuanced more around so many aspects of sort of either the application process for retreats, for students coming on retreats, and or certain strictures around other what other techniques were and were not allowed to be integrated, or in terms of students practice, or if they were doing other practices on their application. And I just found that kind of difficult, that among my peers, among my assistant teacher peers, I I the practice was a given. The practice was kind of, it was assumed that everyone knew exactly how to work. There was nothing new to learn, and uh, and so to vocalize any kind of difficulty with the practice or challenge, or even a success, even some kind of breakthrough or some kind of insight or something, in a kind of a more deeply personal way, was not supported. And I think that that sort of speaks a little bit to a culture where there wasn't a lot of um, questioning, but oddly enough, there wasn't a lot of, sort of um, inspiration of the Dhamma, in terms of conversations or group discussions. Certainly, we rarely spoke about aspects of, the Dhamma at AT meetings. And, I just found that, uh, that became something that was part and parcel of a picture for me that, became problematic, in terms of my own involvement. And at one point, I remember, raising with our local director, just, the need, it seemed like, to have more group discussions. And I was told that at one point Goenka allowed group discussions, but then they somehow either got out of hand, or there was some problem, and so he decided not that that we shouldn't have them. And that was kind of it, like, end of discussion, even though he's passed right now. And I would say that the context has really changed a lot around people, wanting to understand of, aspects of the Dhamma. I mean, the Pali Canon is vast and huge, a huge body of knowledge, and yet, um, even when I joined a Dhamma discussion book where we were reading the suttas directly, that was kind of seen or perceived to be, or looked upon askance, and so I don't know if that's kind of speaking to what you're talking about, but again, I just felt like, outside of certain, what I mentioned in, I think, our last talk, around certain boxes, and the, like, either around Goenkaji, the teacher, or the practice, or the organization, changes to the organization, or even about just even kind of the history of the lineage and what people understood about that, in terms of what was being portrayed. Um, there just didn't seem to be, yeah, a kind of a willingness to really question or tolerate, much uh, discussion.
Yeah, and that's I'm really alarmed by your word choice in using allowed to talk. And this is hitting me in a different way because I'm coming from years of involvement in a totalitarian country in the form of Burma, that where what one is allowed and not to do usually has severe consequences of exile, arrest, imprisonment, even death. And I know we're not talking anywhere near that level, but those words are just ring with me with a certain kind of profundity and alarm when one is thinking about an organization that, in your case, is existing in the West. Many of the people that are involved are that, at least in the discussions you're having, as you described before, are themselves coming from academic backgrounds, or at least professional backgrounds of some kind, where they've used critical thought in any number of ways in their life. And to just pause a minute and speak about what these mature, professional, in many cases critically minded in their field individuals are, quote unquote, allowed to speak and not to speak in different ways, that just, I think that just needs to be kind of bookmarked and flagged there for being fleshed out in further detail. And there's a couple other things I want to flesh out too that I'll leave over to you and hear your thoughts on them. And I think this is also just a good moment for taking time to remember that sometimes when you're in an organization, one can normalize certain things, that it's only by talking about them and expressing them outside of that normal order of things that one realizes that this is quite alarming, to speak about a group of individuals allowed and not allowed to speak about a certain matter. Another thing that stands out is the anecdote you mentioned about how Goenka had at one point permitted some kind of open discussion, but then out of some concerns, some unidentified, vague concerns that happened at some point in time in some situation among some people that no one really seems to know anything about, because of that, there is what I would say sounds like a very authoritarian decision to be able to cut out all critical dialogue and discussion of any kind, perhaps leading towards what the word I've referenced before, confusing. This issue of this is going to be confusing to have people express themselves, talk critically, listen, have some kind of source, some kind of interaction or engagement with one another and seeing one another as possible sources of knowledge rather than a central teacher authority. That will cause confusion. And so that is best accomplished by simply avoiding it completely, either by self censorship or by creating a culture that prevents it, or by having stand-ins of teachers that would explicitly not allow it. The other thing I want to leave you with is just you were mentioning how on the inside of some of these meetings there was a lack of inspiration. You experienced a lack of inspiration in talking about the practice, and an emphasis on and a real focus of these meetings in talking about rules, talking about um, really defining these rules in greater and greater details and nuance. And is this permitted among students, or is this allowed, or is this too far? And if so, what's the penalty for this? And going increasingly into that examination of rules. And so, I would just have a question about why that was, and what you thought this was indicative about. I want to clarify that that there could be, simply because there is a lack of discussion about inspiration and about the benefits of practice, doesn't mean that these teachers, many of them, are not deeply inspired and deeply benefiting from practice. Or it could mean that there's not a direct correlation. So simply because there wasn't a discussion of inspiration, it could mean that was not seen as the correct forum to be able to talking about it, or it could mean something else. But that's something to investigate more, because it's just that surface level knowledge that you shared, that there's that simply wasn't you found. So in these areas that I've mentioned, kind of digging deeper into them and examining them more, what takeaways would you have, or how would you expand on that?
Well, again, and I think it has to do with you know, larger aspects about, you know, what it means to be involved in in the organization. So to kind of be on the inside and representing it, and as opposed to just what it means to be, say, you know, just taking retreats on a peripheral level, and what those two different experiences really are for students. Um, I think that, you know, once you become involved with being, you know, an assistant teacher or a center manager, you are immediately involved with enforcing or upholding a lot of rules and regulations that allow for the functioning, the operation of the courses to happen, the center to happen. And you know, I think that because of the uh, sort of exclusive nature of the practice, a lot of that comes down to um, uh, you know, sort of enforcing notions of like, I mean, in some ways, of you know, what is going to pollute or contaminate one's practice, the center, the actual center where the retreats happen, group sittings, either at the center or in, you know, the ones that were kind of considered official group sittings. And so um, this notion of kind of enforcing a level of purity, um, even pristine purity. These were so many conversations happened with that, I would say, directive or assumption in mind, that there was a purity to maintain at, you know, at the exclusion of any other considerations. And so I, yeah, I found that a lot of regular conversations I would have would center around those rules and regulations, rather than conversations about, you know, more honest, personal, vulnerable conversations around one's practice, one's struggles, one's, and that to admit those would be to, in some ways, you know, that would somehow reflect either poorly on yourself as a representative of the tradition, or on the practice or on the tradition, all those things. And so there's a kind of a currency around what could be, what was sort of could be spoken and what could not be spoken as a in terms of your one's belonging, right? And I think that created a non-critical environment, a non-questioning environment, a non um, exploration or exploring or examining area in on different fronts. Um, and certainly high on there was the practice. You could not question the tenets of the practice, um, and because that would just reveal not just not being with the program. Um, so there was an assumption that you had sort of surrendered yourself to this practice, to Goenka as a teacher, um, and and then as an assistant teacher or senior or full teacher, you were operating and beholding those tenets.
Right. And I think that looking at these kind of strictures not just to not discuss or bring out issues or concerns with parts of the practice, but going deeper than that, at least in my experience and experience of others I know, it's even a question of not really thinking about that, not even really going there in terms of thought, because as you get more and more subtle with the meditation practice and you see the power of thought, and you can feel what thought does to within your mind and within your body, that for me it became even hard to permit myself, and here's that word again, to allow oneself to even go down that road. And this was a complicated thing, because then on the other hand, I mean, I keep going back to this fundamental story that was so important to my development, where I was critically thinking about these matters in such detail, and this teacher told me to stop thinking about it and just go into the practice, and the practice will answer things. And that was and I'd say again, that was really good advice. And it was what I needed to hear at that time. I would not
Yeah,
have developed an
yeah,
understanding of the practice if I had continued on that path when I was there. But it's just a question of applying the right tools for the right circumstance, and those were the right tools for that circumstance. But those were tools that I was encouraged to, and I then encouraged myself and probably encouraged others to have, really with no boundaries. Is this tool that not only can I not critically discuss the practice, but I shouldn't even critically be thinking about these things. And that would go into why I've shared on past discussions that we've had here, that at times when I was simply sharing some documented fact of something I learned in Myanmar, and said it with no emotion and no real desire to want to explain what this means, or debate about the importance of it, but just to explain a certain fact, knowing this fact went against something that is commonly understood through the discourses, or something about the course of the narrative. I would start shaking. I would start shaking, and it would actually be hard for. And this was true whether I was writing or whether I was speaking. And I've tried to say, I think the reason why I was shaking was that I had this fear that, and then dot dot dot. I don't think I've really processed and explored, if I'm honest, deep enough, exactly what was going on to make me to physically feel afraid and uneasy, and have a physical reaction whenever I would start to engage in something that was critical. Even when I would tell myself, my volition is not to do harm. My volition is not to not to be famous. Certainly, I've never wanted that. My volition, whatever the possible volitions are, really exploring those and making sure that those aren't negative ambitions or volitions that are pushing out this what's nothing more than just simply to speak what I find to be true. But just simply doing that would cause this physical reaction, because of this fear of even of mentally going through this. And I don't really, even at this day, I don't really know why, if I can explain where that physical reaction came from, only that it was something that's pretty consistent.
well, and I had a very similar feeling when I began this questioning process. It felt like I was being disloyal. It felt like I was putting at risk my kind of entire belonging to the tradition and to the organization. And that it was so I had similar kind of very visceral physical reactions as I began to look at some of these things, when I began to kind of question aspects of the practice or aspects of the culture and why things were done the way they were, or even simply as things like why the notion um, of Dhamma in Goenka's tradition was, sort of seen as mutually exclusive to psychotherapeutic tools and processes, or separate from, social justice frameworks, or, these things that really, to me, were speaking to really important levels of integration of the practice were were I was being told that they were not part of it. And so when I began to question that, I I felt like I was questioning my entire belonging to the organization. But yet I felt compelled to, because, certainly with the anti-racism work I was doing, I was, in many ways, I felt like I was recovering some of my own humanity in that process, and it was fairly profound. And you know, in the ways that certainly race was being talked about, within the organization, I just felt like there was a huge need for education and a huge need for reflection in this area. And yet, to bring that up was yeah, I mean, in so much I can feel the fear even now, in just, just in terms of what I would anticipate as a response, which was, yeah, no, no, that's not what the, Dhamma doesn't is not that's not part of Dhamma. And I just couldn't, in the end, I couldn't buy that. I couldn't accept that. I just felt like, Dhamma informs all aspects of life, including those pieces. And to sort of separate those out, or have to compartmentalize, what I felt like it was that I couldn't show up really with my whole self as an assistant teacher. Among even my colleagues of other assistant teachers, there were only a few people that I felt like I could really, sort of reveal myself. And I just felt like, well, that's not right, or that I had to kind of compartmentalize myself when I went to the center, because I had to kind of uphold a certain, either the rules or the regulations, or I had to, discuss the practice only in certain ways. And I mean, I know, like, now, just hearing myself speak, I know that, other acharyas would say, well, Jonathan's obviously just negative now, right? Like, that's just the kind of
Hmm. Hmm.
because, when I tried with other very serious old students, and in the tradition, to bring these kinds of issues up to the attention of acharyas, that's in fact how we were labeled. And that was pretty that was pretty, not only was it eye-opening, but it was pretty upsetting. I mean, I think there's a broad range of folks at the acharya level, the full teacher level, where, you know some are more progressive and others are more conservative. But in the end, um, the things that a few of us tried to bring up to that acharya meeting were seen as just negativity, pure and simple. And there was no openness to that feedback, and certainly no follow up, given the amount of effort that went into a pretty formal, presentation and facilitated process for the acharyas. It was just dropped as soon as it was over. Um, so, that was very challenging for me to see, as I began to then try to, and was hopeful, that I could actually present feedback, present, some reflection. And there were some other acharyas who were also, I think, making those same efforts to create more, you know, civil discussion, civil discourse, discussion groups, reflective groups. And that was happening, even across the country. And yet, you know, it didn't seem that those efforts, any of our efforts, were really having an impact on shifting the culture and shifting the mindset. And, that, I think, that resistance to feedback right away is part and parcel of what you might have been experiencing in terms of just the discomfort, right? When you can't say something that is of concern, or you risk your sense of belonging to the organization by doing so. That can be quite upsetting when you've put in a lot of time and effort into a very, you know profound experience in your life that you hold so dear, I mean, sitting retreats and courses and my groups that, all aspects of it was so, important to me. And yet I couldn't show up my full self in many respects.
Yeah, I think that's all quite true, and I think that it's pause. I just lost my train of thought.
I'd also want to say that, if it's okay,
Yeah, go ahead.
um, if I was, and looking at this just through a racial lens, if I was experiencing this as a white male, I'm pretty sure that many folks of color, maybe old students of color, uh, uh, were also experiencing a lot of difficulty in terms of showing up their whole selves in this environment. So I think that's an important thing to say. I don't, I mean, I know certainly from conversations with old students of color that in some cases that was very true, um, and so I just think that it creates a kind of a one way. Um, the communication is only sort of going one way from the organization to the old students, but for it to go, for there to be an exchange, that wasn't really being permitted so much.
Right, and when I hear you say all that, I'm reminded of times when I tried to have these critical conversations, and whatever degree of skillfulness I was able to muster up or not, or whatever. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but at times I received very personal attacks back, and this is not just true of me. This is I know of other people that have also tried to express concerns as skillfully as they can in certain areas, and the personal attacks that they received back really left them silenced and wounded and scared, and that's all definitely true for me. I mean, I've been labeled as having mental illness. I've been labeled as having enormous anger issues that are forcing me to try to bring down a certain teacher or organization based on my rage. I've been told I have personal agendas or am fabricating information. I mean, I've been threatened by Goenka students before that have told me if I come in their area that physically I need to be careful. Um,
Mm.
that's definitely not the norm, but that has happened, and so the physical, I mentioned that happened in one instance that I was threatened. That's far from the norm, and I believe that'd be widely condemned by anyone, any teacher, any person in the organization that happened. But the other instances were very common, and those are the things I'd focus on more. Is that the and it should be said, even the decision to do a discussion like this and eventually when it airs publicly, it is scary. Like I know I will be attacked. I will there will be something very personal coming that will be painful to have to see because I'm a shy person. I'm an introvert. I love having podcast conversations and talking about content, but I don't really I don't have a need for myself or my life to be out there. And I think for me, what the you mentioned how you weren't able to bring your whole self to it. And I think that's actually something very similar to me in a way I've never thought about before this and very different from yours. In my sense, I was undertaking this practice I had so much faith in and so much reverence, and reverence to the point that when I went to Burma, when I went there to live, I had really no interest in any other practice or belief or Buddhism as a religion or anything else. I really just wanted to go deep into this practice and to benefit as I can. And as I came to learn, and people who listen to this podcast know I have a knowledge of history and politics and culture and so much else. The reason some of that study came along and some of that interest came along was that over time I began to learn, oh, I can, if I understand better about Burmese culture and history and context and everything else, where this technique comes from and how I'm practicing will actually enrich my life and my practice. And so all of that study and interest in the outside world of Burma, the politics, as some people like to say, although I would say that's a pretty narrow term for what I'm describing, really was born out of an interest to want to enrich my practice and to want to not practice in a vacuum, but to want to really be integrated and holistic and knowing where my practice came from. And I was in the place where it came from. I had such an opportunity that so few people had to really investigate and explore, not in an academic way, but in just a personal and casual and curious way, really curious way to be able to explore and to learn and to benefit and to enrich my practice. And in many ways it did, in many, many ways, learning, being able to visit the sites and learn the histories and meet the peers and students of some of these lineage figures, it was just so magical and incredible for me. And it did things in terms of appreciating and revering the practice in ways where it's just kind of spoon fed to you and hand delivered in a 10-day format anywhere in the world. Doesn't do to the same extent. It was so alive and so vibrant and so wonderful. Um, but at the same time, as I started to go through, as I started to more than casually learn about these things and want to cite them and be more curious and write down more and read more and ask more, as I started to go through that process, I just started to uncover more and more things that just didn't add up and didn't meet with the practice as it was and the narrative as it was being explained to me. And so I ended up living in two different worlds that it took me years to reconcile. It was extremely difficult. Of on one hand, I believe in the practice, I believe in the teacher, I believe in the narrative, I believe in the organization. I maybe believe is the wrong word, maybe a sense of faith, gratitude, reverence, transformative qualities. Certainly this is, and these things can't be questioned. They can't be questioned because they're very real, and I'm very grateful for them. On the other hand, I believe in, and I have a certain faith in documented history and the people I'm talking to and the experiences I'm having, what I'm seeing, what I'm asking about, and that also can't be passed away. And so I went for some time really trying to play games with one or the other, trying to break down one or build up the other, or find clever twisting reasons or justifications how one could lead to the other and how they really were saying the same thing. And really trying as hard as I could to maintain the proper reverence I had for some things, while also not being bothered or disturbed by things that didn't line up. And I kept at that for years, and eventually it just was too much for one person to hold. And also I think part of it was that when there were openings and invitations from people within the organization to want to hear about some of the things that I was learning and writing about and sharing, to want to hear about that, I believed in good faith the knowledge that these people were interested to want to share. But as soon as the knowledge started to be disseminated or started to be shared according, upon the invitation of this, there was a real fear that suddenly this knowledge was going to be detrimental to those things that you talk about, which, those boxes which can't be opened. And it was quickly, the thing that was started was quickly shut down by the same person. And the only way to accomplish that is by shutting down the individual, which in that case was me. And so, yeah, that's just, I didn't mean to go into all this, but that's a bit of my own trajectory in terms of the difficulty I had in trying to balance these different parts of myself: the faith, the growth, the spirituality, the technique, the Dhamma, and then the lived experiences of being in a place where I actually had the privilege of learning about some of these things, not from one source, but from being able to have them come from different sources in different ways, and being challenged with that. And yeah, just it in my case, it just kind of became too much to hold in one person. I tried many years. I probably tried longer than I should have, but it eventually wasn't compatible, really.
Yeah, and I think it is a lot to hold. It's very all encompassing when you join a group or a tradition like this that is, where you've had such profound sort of transformative experiences, say through a practice like, like Vipassana. And I think that was what, again, that dissonance between, having those really profound experiences on my retreats, that changed my life and continued to change my life every time I sat retreats. this was not just a one and done deal. It was an ongoing experience. And then to have that sort of contrasted with um, an organization and tradition where you know your sense of belonging um, is dependent on not being able to kind of openly question things, or there were just a lot of things that didn't make sense that, you know, again, you couldn't question that, you know, that I found that increasingly disturbing. And, you know, and to the point where at some point you know, I was grateful because one of the acharyas initiated a conversation on the non-sectarian nature of the tradition. And that, you know, that tenet was always considered a given. It is considered a given within the Goenkaji tradition that it is non-sectarian and universal. And but this acharya decided to have open discussion groups where that was one topic that was raised, and the discussion of, you know, being involved with a sect. What is, you know, looking at the definition of non-sect, what does that mean, non-sectarian? What does a sect mean? Is it all negative to be involved with a sect? Is it positive? Are there positive aspects? And just chewing on that, just, you know, sort of massaging that for the first time was such a liberating thing, because that cornerstone of what, you know, something Goenkaji, you know, refers to in terms of his, you know, his tradition as being non-sectarian, was, you could never kind of question that. But I had to say, it also opened up a bigger question for me. You know, at one point I had to ask myself, you know, you know, was I in a cult? And that was, you know, when I asked that question of myself, because I had certainly thought I had, you know, addressed that much earlier on as I entered into Goenka's tradition. But at some point I began to think, you know, is are there pieces of being involved here that are um, reflective of kind of cult behavior? And, you know, when I opened that up, it really frightened me. It really shook me to my core to question things on that end. But I felt like I owed it to myself to pursue that. And I began to, you know, I looked, you know, I did started researching, you know, particularly with the International Cultic Studies Association. And um, it was very helpful to kind of look at where in terms of the sort of organizational behaviors did the Goenka tradition fit into some of the well-established, well-researched schemes of, you know, group dynamics, or groups that are involved with, you know, so-called education, or you might say persuasion or influence. You know, these are all, you know, these are all notions that are examined, you know, within the research that's being done on cult behavior. And, you know, I wasn't, in some ways I wasn't too surprised. You know, I you know, there's one researcher who's looked a lot at the kind of the spectrum of, you know, it, she refers to it as the continuum of influence and persuasion. This is Margaret Singer. She's a kind of a well-known kind of cult researcher, and there's a spectrum that she creates between um, education and um, well, now, you know, cult is such a loaded term. It's actually not, we don't refer to cults anymore. It's actually called thought reform. So where, you know, where a body of knowledge centers on changing people without their knowledge. So that's kind of the level of indoctrination, or, you know, but she looks at a whole spectrum between education as being, you know, as looking at many bodies of knowledge, an exchange, a two-way exchange of knowledge, um, to the next step, which would be she calls advertising, you know, and this is where it involves, you know, knowledge of products and how to sell it and how to persuade people to buy things. Where again, the exchange is really quite, you know, is more, there is exchange, but it's more one sided. And then the next step is propaganda, uh, where again it gets more and more one-sided, but for larger aims around, you know, political issues, and you know, issues concerning nation states, or, and then, you know, full out indoctrination is the next step, where there's just very limited exchange, and, you know, there's the communication is really just through very formal channels, that's one way, um, you know, in a hierarchical structure. And then finally, where it's, thought reform, or what we used to call kind of cult behavior, which is just an all, you know, completely, it's a deceptive, it's abusive, it's coercive, it's, where authoritarian and hierarchical structure is, um, there's just no, um, even awareness of what's actually happening in that structure for your average participant. And so as I began to kind of look at her schemes and the schemes of other folks that I was researching, I saw that, really in many ways, there isn't that open exchange. There isn't an open exploration of the Buddhist teachings within Goenka's tradition. It's very conscribed, and it's very one way. And I think that in some ways, the profound experiences I was having in my practice, um, and my desire to have more of those, I was giving, in some ways, my permission. I was giving some part of myself away. You talked earlier about permission, and how, you know that that does become, I think, a really key piece, because I was giving kind of parts of myself away because I wanted these incredible transformative experiences with meditation. But the price of that, again, was not to kind of accept a one-sided body of knowledge, a one-sided um, um, set of rules and regulations that was come from a hierarchical structure. And at some point I felt that, um, my experience of myself, like I say, it felt more and more compartmentalized, and less whole. So yeah, just to speak to some of that that discomfort there. Yeah,
Mm.
and it was hard because, again, like, when I began to look at this, I was still, I was still very hopeful. I was still, I um I was, still sitting retreats, still getting so much from them, and yet just it wasn't squaring with what I was seeing in the organization and in the tradition, and within other meditators who had been doing this for many, many decades too. I just saw a similar kind of compartmentalization, a certain type of, certain emotional bypass happening in so many folks I was interacting with, and I felt like I couldn't sort of be myself.
So in analyzing thought reform and starting to realize that this is not black or white. I mean, I think for those of us who've never delved into this, it you just kind of hear like, oh, someone has joined a cult, and that's the end of that, and it's this really extreme, incredible thing. But as you break that down and as you look at it in more detail, there's this gradation, and there's this there's experts in the field have looked at these different stages going more towards this thought reform than others, and some that go in extreme versions. So as you started to study different lenses and different academic understandings of cult slash thought reform, and you were mirroring that with your own experience in the Goenka organization, what did you find? What shaped up there?
Well, a lot of it, some of it happened because I was inspired by a personal friend of mine, Jarrett Buglian, who wrote a book called An Everyday Cult. And this was a kind of a personal memoir around her and her husband's experience in an everyday cult. And as I began to read, the description of what she was describing, which was not this, well, um, yes, there were aspects of the cult that were very coercive and manipulative, but um, so I called her up. I said, Jarette, what, this is the situation I find myself in. Excuse me, and she asked me around questions around finances. Did I perceive that people were being harmed, and also around abuse issues, or sexual dynamics, or anything like that. And on all these fronts, Goenkaji's tradition is really quite, is squeaky clean. He was very clear about establishing these norms and guidelines around protecting issues of financial abuse or sexual scandal, and he was very clear about that. Um, but on more subtle aspects, there are, I think, um, and again, I don't want to at all associate, because I don't, the word, again, the word cult is very loaded, and it does have to do, I think, it does describe what I understand is that describes a very coercive, abusive, manipulative experience. Um, it, and I don't see that happening in the Goenka tradition, but I saw that there are ways of, the kind of the emotional bypass that goes on, the lack of being able to question the one way kind of exchange with leadership, and with exploring even the practice itself, um, and yeah, just the dynamics around, um, just not allowing open questioning, some of the insularity of the tradition compared to other sort of peer groups. I mean, Goenka's tradition is very known for just not interacting, not at all participating in open forums, conferences, um, uh, you know, um, collaborations with other groups that are teaching the Buddhist teachings, however you want to frame that, Dhamma or Buddhism or whatever. But again, um, and so I really needed to look at that. And I began to see that there was, in the dynamics, there were just a lot of aspects of suppression happening. And I saw that in kind of almost a kind of a psychology of the organization. And I realize I'm speaking kind of in broad terms here, but yeah, I just felt that, um, in that non-questioning place, there were issues around who was in, who was not in, how much were they in, how much were they not in. Um, those issues of belonging and, inclusivity were there. That I just felt that just, um, there was just a lot of, I found there was a lot of fear-based behavior, I guess, in, myself and in other, colleagues, within the tradition, and even what you're describing, it sounded a little bit like that too, when you begin to kind of question stuff that is like being gripped by fear, and so yeah, I just felt like that you had to. There was just a uniformity that you had to subscribe to, that, um, just yeah, I guess just became increasingly difficult for me to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to a concept we were talking about in the last conversation, the take home message, and that there are many things said, and then there are less things that are actually done, or the behaviors of how one acts and relates. The culture is more limited and focused and singular, I would even say, in terms of defining what the culture is and isn't. And yet the the way it's described, and the messages that are being used are anything but. They're dynamic, they're inclusive, they're really optimistic and promising, and everything else. And I think that the difference between the two becomes the take home message. And that's why it could be so hard to talk about these things, because everything that you're saying and everything that I'm saying, I think anyone listening at home could say, well, wait a second. On day 5, Goenka, of the 10-day discourse on day 5, Goenka clearly says this technique or this organization is meant to be like this and not like that. And yes, all of that evidence is there in the corpus of what he talked about. But I think when one looks at the take home message of some of these things, it's not looking at the literal things that are said at different points, but it's looking at what is the reasonable take home message that most people who'd been around for some time would come to understand. And when you ask that message, it's usually just one thing, no matter what you're talking about, no matter what the subject, it's usually, and no matter where someone is from. I think you can really fairly easy define and come down on this particular, whatever the point is, on this particular point or this particular conversation. This is really the take home message. This is really how we're supposed to feel about it, even
Yeah,
though that
yeah.
wouldn't be found in any formal thing.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a great, I mean, Goenka tells a great story, and in the discourses of like, of, someone getting a prescription, from his doctor, and then going home and, um, just not fulfilling the prescription, but actually just reciting the prescription, like just 2 pills in the morning, 2 pills in the
Mm,
evening, and that is what the person thinks out of ignorance is what he needs to do with the prescription. Just this rote recitation. And then there's another situation where a person gets a prescription and he goes home and instead of sort of fulfilling prescription, he just starts debating with his family members or other friends, oh, your doctor is useless. My doctor is the best. My doctor has understands the real cause of, illness or whatever. And so he's just sort of debating all that. And, um, and so, the reflection there is of just how important it is to just sort of take the medicine, right? Sort of utilize the prescription experientially.
mm,
And yet, in fact, I feel like that's kind of that notion of, my doctor is the best doctor, all your doctors are useless, is in fact a kind of a ethos of
yeah,
the Goenka tradition.
yeah,
In the end, that becomes the take home message,
yeah.
really. And
Hmm.
it of course, you couch it in total terms. It's a you might say it's a Trojan horse. You don't you don't say that right up front, but you're hoping, I think, to that's in fact, you want to attract your friends and colleagues and family to sit courses, and hope that they start to see all that. But it becomes, also the notion of that the practice is also, this practice is the best practice. All other practices are useless, or they're indirect, or and that, it just doesn't hold up when you read the entire, when you go through the Pali Canon. There's just so many aspects to the Buddhist teachings, and we can't say that this is the one and only way. Um, and I think, since I began to do more research into the Pali Canon and into just, the definitions that I had, completely accepted as sacrosanct around, even, some of Goenkaji's hallmark definitions around Vedana as physical sensations, or Sampajanya, in terms of, um, a constant, thorough understanding of impermanence at the level of sensations only. You know, the those cracks began as those cracks kind of began and opened up for me. I I thought, well, how can a tradition that is claiming to be, to take folks to enlightenment, um, and is not willing to subject its own tenets to examination, to what, I just, and it's kind of couched it, well, it's got to only be experiential, otherwise it's not valid, and it's, you just have to experience it, and that just becomes the substitute, I think, for critical discourse and critical conversation and critical listening. And I, I, yeah, in the end, as much benefit as I feel like I received, and I did, I really feel that my time in Goenka tradition did establish me on the path of Dhamma that I'm eternally grateful for. But it was at a price of of being of not being able to uh, engage critically, to have my feedback, listened to or accepted or taken into consideration. And in the end, I couldn't represent that any longer.
And I think this is this example of where the take home message comes of there's this messaging that we're not here to criticize other techniques, and where and this anecdote you share about, you know, all these other doctors are useless, and mine is mine knows more than all the others, and that story is meant to illustrate how you're supposed to practice and not get caught up in these intellectual debates. And yet there's also, you know, those examples are also contrasted with other parts where, you know, in the 10-day discourse, he mocks the Mahasi tradition, and in the 20-day discourse, he mocks the Sunlun tradition, both from Burma. And so what is one to make of that? You know, how is one to be able to on one hand take in this understanding that we're really not we're not going to engage with other traditions or discuss them or critically debate them, even for benefit. We're not going to go there. We're just going to only stay in our lane, close off kind of critical analysis or practice of being able to understand that difference. But we're also not going to criticize. And yet, then on the other side of the mouth, then it's like, but Mahasi's doesn't work because of this, and Sunlun doesn't work because of that. He doesn't name the traditions. He doesn't say Mahasi and Sunlun, but the way that the by describing slow walking and hard breathing respectively, those are the traditions that are obviously being talked about. And so as students, how do you internalize this? Well, in any organization or family or community or anything, you're always copying the culture and the behavior of the leader, consciously or subconsciously. You're always doing that. And so if there are hypocrisies, if there are things that don't add up, if there is if there's some kind of difference between what I say and what I do, well, that behavior is going to be learned. It's going to be learned subconsciously and subliminally, and then it's going to be continued. And so then the question comes, like, what is the take home message? Is the take home message in the heart of hearts, is it that we're not here to criticize other techniques and to just be worried about ours? Or is it that this technique is the right one and the other ones can't be correct? Well, I would argue it's the latter. You know, I would say that that's really the that would never be said, it would never be acknowledged, but I would argue that is probably what's being taken home. And I remember when I did a 20-day course, I had done several of them, but then at one point I did a 20-day course where I actually knew who Sun Lun was. But in the discourses on in one of the early days, he references how there's a monastery in Burma where when you start walking up, the people are breathing so hard that it sounds like a locomotive, and it sounds like they're getting ready to go on a train, and that this is not. And then he contrasts this with the way that we have to be observing normal breath, and he laughs and he gets a laugh out of it. And when I didn't know who Sun Lun was, I just thought, oh, you know, these silly people, like, that's really funny. Like, they're just like, it sounds like, you know, they're making the sound of a locomotive and they're supposed to be doing meditation. That's a really funny joke. Well, Sun Lun Sayadaw is one of the most respected, revered Sayadaws of the 20th century. He's a
Right.
friend of Webu Sayadaw, who's in the tradition, and it's one of the major traditions of Burma today. He is believed by many to be fully enlightened. His story is incredibly inspirational, of a kind of a hard scrabble farmer who was illiterate and had never really practiced or been a monk, and he somehow gained access to some teacher who and then rigorously applied himself, and is considered by many to be fully enlightened. And I broke down when I heard that on a 20-day discourse, when I knew who he was, because
Mm.
I was like, I have never in my life heard ridicule of a revered monk who many believe to be enlightened. And I was extremely uncomfortable and pained. I was actually pained and hurt. It was more just a question of, it wasn't so much of anger or of being critical or complaining. It was really hurt. It was really just like, I remember sitting there after the discourse and just thinking, like, why would you do this? You know,
Mm.
why there's no need to. Why would you go out of your way to make everyone laugh at one of the greatest monks of the 20th century of Burma, who many consider to be completely enlightened? And there's no point in this, that you don't get anything out of it. And that was what that anecdote was kind of what set me on a journey to start to wonder about the motivations of these things, and to not just take this as faith and reverence and unquestioning instructions and narratives that were coming, or when you're just trying to understand something on a deeper level, and just start to wonder, start to look at certain ways things were framed or said or set up, and just kind of ask, well, now why would you do it this way? Like you don't actually lose anything by not doing this. You probably do lose things by doing it. So why make the choice in this instance? And then in many others, it's different. But in this instance, why would you make the choice to publicly humiliate Sun Lun Sayadaw, not by name, but by practice, where you know that he's the one being talked about? Why would you do that? What would be in the psychology of someone to think that's a good idea?
I would just answer branding. I think, when I think back at the time context of the recordings of these discourses, when Goenkaji is referring to these other practices, we're talking mid '80s, early '90s, and you know, Myanmar was again a country that was virtually cut off from the rest of the world at that time. Things didn't open up, I don't think, from my recollection, until 1993, I think, when Goenkaji himself was allowed to go back to Myanmar. And so again, did is that was the thought process that, oh well, my students will never know who this person was, because Myanmar was so cut off, Burma was so cut off. The world has changed now, right? Like these teachers, these other practices that Goenkaji just not only sort of distinguishes himself with, but kind of in a kind of, yeah, puts down really, um, are now being able to be explored and investigated, because the world has opened up. The internet has opened everything up. Social media has opened everything up. You can't not, you can't just accept what one person is saying to you, and thinking, okay, that's the brand I'm going to take, because that's the only input I have here. But I would say that the motivation was a form of branding, Goenkaji's technique and his practice. And I think that that notion of branding was an important framework for me to kind of look at what was kind of going on here, um, in terms of the tradition, and in some of the history, from what just from how I understand that, Goenkaji kind of began to sort of you know build a reputation and an empire and a network of centers all around the world. It There was a branding component going on in that history of his ascent, from the days, I think, when he came to India, even. um, you know he I think he likens himself to you know being the person who brought the Dhamma back to India, from Myanmar. But Munindraji had been in India teaching the Dhamma for 5 years prior to Goenkaji's arrival in India. So some of this was a lot. I think what I would can only describe as myth making around a brand, and around history, and around elevating Goenkaji, to a kind of an unquestioned status in terms of as a teacher of the Dhamma.
Right. And I think this is another case where someone could jump in and say, well, I think maybe that's happened because that's how people are. And you see more of that in India. And, oh, but this is never what he wanted. He's so clearly said this thing on day second discourse. And then he said this thing in the server's just explanation or whatever else. And yes, to go back again, like, yes, there are many, many, many things that Goenka said that made it very clear. There are anecdote after anecdote that made it clear that he understood the danger of guruism, and that he did not want to set up anything that would possibly go in that mold, or that would have. And I think on the question of branding, one would just simply refute that by saying, well, this is, how do you brand the pure Dhamma? Well, that's the brand. That's the brand. I mean, the brand is that there is no brand. The sect is that it's non-sectarian. And the word non-sectarian becomes the sectarian way to describe the inner workings of that group. And I think this is, again, where you go to that take-home message. What is the take-home message that is being given here? And I think that if there's one kind of thing that you're left with as a take-home message, and this is something that took me a long time to unpack and explore, is that Goenka is kind of painted, and he's painted by himself because no one else talks. I mean, there's no one else that's giving these descriptions or this culture or this or putting something new out there. It's really just all coming from him and then being disseminated and shared in different ways. But he he speaks about himself almost in a passive way, almost in a way that undermines and even hides the incredible amount of work he did to set up what it was he set up. He almost places himself as this passive instrument of the Dhamma, just as all the other lineage holders were also passive in their own way. They're just servants of this wheel that it's time to turn, and all they did and all that the ATs below them do and the teachers below them do is play their role to take a box of purity and pass it from one generation to the other, making sure that it's not contaminated. And there's nothing else really to it than that. It's really just this playing this passive role that's perhaps preordained by some kind of fate or karma of or prophecy of how things will turn out, and there's kind of nothing more to see there. And that when you're trying to break down and analyze a brand that is not being driven by a personality, or conceivably not being driven by a personality, but rather inner workings of fate and karma and prophecy, that people are just playing their preordained role, it's that's a very tricky brand to unpack and to really understand how it's working. And in some ways, I would, and I've made this argument before, I think because of this narrative and this messaging, I have argued that I think that the role that Goenka played and the credit that he deserves is actually underappreciated, because he had to make a series of unprecedented decisions to be able to come from to have this technique from one of the great teachers of what has now become an oppressive country that he's in exile of, and to deliver this sets of teachings outside of the monastery to a non-Buddhist population, hopefully around the world for free, with the before the internet, and just on and on. I mean, you could just go
Yeah, no,
into
no,
to how
it's
many more.
remarkable. It's remarkable what he accomplished, and I agree. You really, it's all inspiring. When I think about just my own process of, I was, as a teenager, I was definitely a seeker, and I didn't know really what to do with that. I saw, and I had like my best friend uh, took a college program and went to Nepal and eventually to Tibet. And I thought, well, okay, that's great, but I can't do that necessarily. So where am I? How am I? And the fact that in that I was able to come in contact with these teachings in Western Massachusetts after I'd moved there from New York was nothing short of a miracle. But yes, to have had all that happen, what in terms of the challenges and the obstacles that Goenkaji did face to leave Myanmar, to establish himself in India, to trust that that he was himself, and he certainly talks about this, that he was an instrument of the force of Dhamma, you might say, or the vibration of Dhamma, or the even just the, you might say, the prophesied spread of Dhamma, that he was just an instrument of that. But yet he undertook unbelievable efforts to do that in a way that has allowed hundreds of thousands of people to take refuge in the Buddhist teachings, to live a moral life, to develop their minds, and to have an understanding of to have a faith in a process that's toward liberation, towards human liberation, right? So I want to acknowledge that as well, and yet it wasn't passive, right? As you say, Joa, there were a lot of things happening in that process that were, I think, also about asserting a position and asserting a branding process, really, in the ways that I think historically, I think that's already been documented, that he, his breakaway from his own mentor, Sayamaji, and his differentiating from the tradition that Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and Robert Hover and Sharon Salzberg established at the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. These separations that happen were, I think, also part and parcel of. I mean, you hear about them, and I certainly learned about them, and kind of accepted the premises. But in many ways, I think uh, there was also just there was a branding piece happening alongside those decisions.
Right. And I think that when you lose Goenka as an active agency and what an active agency that was, and when you relegate him by his own admission and design as an instrument of Dhamma, two things happen, at least two things happen that are very different as a result of that decision. One is that, as I mentioned before, you don't properly credit him with how incredible he had to navigate those challenges. And so, even I would argue that even teachers and students of his own tradition don't really properly appreciate just how there was no roadmap for what he was doing. And he did something that no one's really done to this day in terms of what he was able to set up, how he was able to do it for free, what kinds of, for all the some of the concerns there might be, what kind of package he was able to prepare and then have that quality prepared at any center around the world, and just how he literally brought a liberating teaching of the Buddha to corners of the world that in all of recorded human history have never seen before. And so, but we lose appreciation for how he did it when he's just an instrument of Dhamma, because then it becomes kind of boring. It just kind of becomes like, well, yeah, this was what was bound to happen, and he played his role, and you lose that agency of that active agency of the incredible decisions he had to make. But then in the course of making decisions, anytime you make a decision, there's a sacrifice. That's just the nature of a decision. If you choose to preference this, then you're not preferencing that. And so some of the criticisms that come from how he set things up are not so much criticisms of, well, you did this wrong, and this is you should have done it this way, or you didn't do this right. It's, in some ways it might be that, in other ways it might be that whenever you're setting anything up, you have to make decisions. And in order to preference this benefit, he had to suffer this consequence. That's just the nature of a decision. That's one consequence um, of how we lose our critical analysis of seeing him as an active agent when we just see him as this instrument of Dhamma. The other consequence, I would argue, is this loss of critical thought, which is what we've gone into in so many other discussions around this. And that's, if someone is an active agency in terms of making decisions, setting rules, setting up organizations, procedures, teachings, the whole thing that runs with it. If someone is doing that and it's very clear that they're an active agency in doing that, you can revere them and admire them as an active agency. Even while doing so, you can also recognize that they're the ones in charge. They're the ones doing this. But when you remove that understanding that someone there is actually doing something, and instead this is just all an instrument of Dhamma, what is there to criticize? What is there to critically analyze? What
Well,
is there
right.
to investigate?
You can't question when it's a force of Dhamma, when you've subsumed yourself. And I think that's a piece of what also the way I think the organization holds itself is as a force of Dhamma that cannot be questioned because it is literally a force of Dhamma. So, when you take these kind of ultimate concepts and they are essentially utilized um, as ways of not questioning kind of regular mundane aspects of the execution of that organization, for example, or of routine rule, routine and maybe arbitrary rules and regulations, because it's a force of Dhamma that's sort of creating this or decreeing this or making this happen. You're that's what I kind of also found over and over again is this kind of utilization of these ultimate concepts to kind of deny or invalidate or dismiss very mundane aspects of how the organization runs or what would make more sense. And again, I'll just bring up some of the racial work that I was trying to bring to the attention of of the acharyas was that just in a, at most organizations were responding to all of the kind of racial uprisings in the wake of George Floyd's murder, by, for example, creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, or taking actions to listen to their constituents of color. Um, and, there were some clear best practices that organizations would want to do, and one of them, of course, is just tracking demographic information so that you could be in communication with your constituents of color. But if you're not going to, the reason you're not going to track demographic information is because the Dhamma doesn't, integrate with social identities, and therefore we can't do that in our organization. Then you're really using these kind of ultimate concepts to really, I think, um, downplay and perpetuate exclusivity in racial in a racial way. And so it was these kind. Yeah, I think this is where I think the conflation with um, this notion of ultimate reality or the force of Dhamma, and that the organization is you know is 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 an instrument of that as well. Not just Goenkaji, but the entire organization is as well, and therefore it can't be these tenets can't be questioned.
Right, and I think that goes into this. I mentioned before our interview started that as I was thinking this morning, as I was thinking about where this interview would go, and where the last one ended, I was a bit. I had to think a bit more about it because up until now, everything's been quite sequential in terms of how the story's been told, and now we're getting more into thoughts and analysis and things that are happening in the mind. And so I was trying to think, well, where should this naturally go? Where should we pick off? And as I was thinking about that and I was reflecting on where we ended the last discussion, which was on me looking at Orientalist attitudes of meditators in Burma, and you looking at the experience of people of color and white privilege and institutional racism, and seeing where these actually came together in a way, as I kicked off this episode, that one was fearful and even in discussing this just because it would point to some imperfection. These are all these two examples and so many other examples are really examples of knowledge and things that's existing out there in the world. And so the phrase that came to me that I suddenly have been thinking about quite a bit ever since and unpacking, and goes in line with this, is that for an organization that is so invested in the development of insight and wisdom, they have a knowledge problem and they're afraid of knowledge. And what I mean by that, by breaking that down, is that, well, what is knowledge, first of all? I mean, knowledge can be so many things, and so many things that we learn in the world, that we experience, that we study, that we learn, academia. Uh, Insight or wisdom is this kind of inner force of realization and awakening that break through all this duality of the world. And to go back to when I personally started doing meditation, why I wanted to do it, as I was a recent college graduate, it was really seeing the limitations of knowledge, and it was really seeing that knowledge can only carry us so far, and we can't think our way as a Western college graduate. This sharpened knife I have to critically analyze things, it's actually not going to make me happy. It's not going to make me understand who I am. It's not
Right.
going to fulfill me. And this was a huge insight in realizing that this was not going to bring me where I wanted to go. And so when the Goenka technique came into my life, it was absolutely perfect. It was this piercing light of awakening and insight that showed the limitations of knowledge in really a beautiful and powerful way. But then, as one progresses on, well, for me, as I progressed on, and I'm reminded of something you said earlier in this episode, where you were talking about kind of a lack of curiosity among teachers that you were talking to. And I remember for myself, I remember specifically thinking in my mind as I got grounded in the technique and consider myself a serious old student, that I felt like I had personally come to a place of an end of knowledge, and I felt that with a kind of pride. I kind of felt like I didn't need to go to, before I used to like going to bookstores or, just kind of looking at titles or whatnot. And even like I'd pass by bookstores and I'd almost have a sense of pride, like I don't need anything there. I have come to a point of end of knowledge because this insight is the piercing thing which will deliver me. And I think that this knowledge, not all knowledge, but some knowledge definitely comes from intellectual pursuits, academia, from experts. And I think that built into the discourses and the narrative, again, the take home message of the organization, I'm sure there's things that can be found that would dispute this, but the take home message is really one, I would argue, of anti-intellectualism, of
Mhm.
a fear or discomfort
Mm.
of people who have studied. And Goenka himself was not well versed in study, and he did have a legitimate fear of not wanting to say or do something as a teacher that was out of ignorance of his lack of study, which someone who had studied would be able to know and identify right away. And he was very careful in wanting to get the appropriate tutors and to have people check what he was going to say, just to make sure that he was properly in line with people that were more intellectually minded. But I think built into a lot of the discourses and the narrative and the take home message is this real fear and ridicule and aversion to anything approaching the intellectual or academic field as being something that was actually harmful to the practice, something that the practice needed to be protected from. That these endless intellectual debates were were actually the enemy of the pure practice, and that needed to be avoided among with conversations among students, with outside intellectual pursuits that critically examined what one was doing, with engaging with other kind of academics that really one needed to avoid this. And you've referenced some anecdotes that Goenka told on the courses. The ones that come to my mind, well, there's he compares the practice to the autobahn, the German
Yeah, yeah.
highway, where one simply is going straight endlessly on a road, without needing to really stop or be curious or investigate or get. And the way he's sharing it is you don't need to kind of get lost on this side road or this little venture there. Certainly that's part of the Audubon, but also part of the Audubon is that it's an end of knowledge. There's nothing interesting. There's nothing left to explore. You have everything you need. A second anecdote I would put to that is the story of the housewife who is washing laundry and using a detergent to get the soap out. And in the course of telling this story, Goenka describes how, as meditators, we're the housewife, and we don't need to know what chemical agents in the detergent are actually taking the dirt out of the clothing. The housewife doesn't need to know that. She just needs to do the procedure correctly. And this is a very inspiring story in how it's delivered, in that
Right.
you don't need to know, you don't need to be this trained academic or monk or whatever. You can come from any walk of life, step into a course, learn the technique and practice it, and you'll get benefit. And that's enough. And that's all true. But the other side of that story is the housewife should not be curious about what's actually in the detergent. She should just rotely be listening to the instructions to follow to wash it and never deviating from them.
Yeah. Yeah. I also I love that emphasis on just the experiential aspect of the practice, right? And that experience, the experience of that of deepening wisdom, of you know, however you want to frame it. I mean, and that's something we can certainly talk about in terms of the framework of the practice, but just that experiential wisdom that comes from facing our deepest impurities with equanimity and that pure mind that comes from that develops from developing those qualities. I loved that emphasis on experiential wisdom, and I am also someone who is very intellectual and wants to understand things on an intellectual basis, on a critical thinking level. Um, I think the problem is that when the emphasis on experiential wisdom is situated at as you know exclusive to exploring or examining or looking at things from a more intellectual way. That discounts a lot of folks who, like yourself and myself, you know um, need to also understand things on an intellectual basis, right? And I think there does run a kind of anti-intellectualism in the tradition, even though there are some great intellectuals within the tradition. But it's almost as if that part of themselves is not really permitted so much in when it comes down to aspects of the practice or the context in which the practice is situated. And the history and the tradition and certainly the scriptures. Yeah, so I think it's when it's at the exclusion of that it really becomes problematic.
Yeah, and I would actually challenge a bit the phrasing you just had of that there are people that might need this greater intellectual understanding or might have that proclivity. I definitely think there are those kinds of personalities, but I would say that this framing of it, this framing device, is not just excluding those people, but it's instilling a kind of fear and closed offness and paranoia in everyone because when you're consistently getting a message that this is this is the story of the practice and this is how you do it.
In some ways, you're saying it's inculcating a message of not to question, not to even begin questioning.
Right,
That it's better not to question.
and the fear of doing that, and really like this is the technique that one is to do, and don't f it up, like don't go into these other areas. You don't need to do that. We've done everything and this is what's being delivered. Just take this and just and practice this without needing to go here and there because life is short and the time is so valuable, and spend every minute on the essence of this practice and
And
not this
right.
critical analysis of it.
And if you do that, you don't have sufficient faith. And I think that's another message that becomes really is another take-home message: is that if you do have a kind of a questioning propensity or a critical propensity, then that means you don't have sufficient faith. But again, that takes the whole notion of faith also, I think, to this extreme where I when I left the organization and the tradition, I began to understand faith, which Goenkaji really does centralize and prioritize. But I understand that there can also be excessive faith. That faith needs to be in balance with the other factors of mindfulness, so that such as effort, such as wisdom, and that if it's out of balance, then your practice is actually going to suffer. So balance is really important with faith. But in Goenka tradition, he puts an enormous preeminence on faith, and culturally, the tradition really says, if you're questioning things, that means you don't have sufficient faith. And I think that's sad for me. That's really sad.
And I think that because the faith is not, I would actually argue the faith is not in a person, that we've established that Goenka did not present himself as an active agent that was making decisions and therefore isn't appreciated as much as he should be in what he did, but rather as an instrument of Dhamma. This fear of the loss of purity and this expression of this pristine purity that's been described, and how intellectual engagement or critical thought can actually be one of the biggest dangers and enemies to a potential loss of purity. This is why it becomes so hard to talk about and to engage with, because it's not the purity of a person or a savior and certainly not of an active agent. It's a kind of pristine purity of a prophecy that has unfolded, and that we are just at best instruments of where we serve in line with this prophecy. And that's the purity that has to somehow be maintained and protected. And that fear of contamination is contamination by talking to people about other techniques, by analyzing this technique, by expressing or even thinking concerns that one has, and trying to understand those concerns. All of those things in some way can lead to contaminating this pristine purity that is characterized on this transmission of Dhamma, where this entire engine, this entire organization is but a humble servant of of this flow that's already taking place. And so how can you possibly engage with a humble servant that's just one small piece of this greater prophecy unfolding and taking shape before us?
Right, right. And what I began to sort of observe was that there were a lot of students after, perhaps after their first or second long course, or after many courses, that their practices began to kind of, as they described it, plateau, and that they had questions, but that they didn't feel like that they could go to an assistant teacher because they felt that they were just going to get a rote response or a parroted response, parroted in terms of like what Goenkaji might say, um, and and so that was one of the things that began to really, I was working with other old students around this feedback for the acharyas around the are you know is Goenkaji's tradition a mechanism for just kind of a widespreading of the Dhamma around the world, or is it really invested in developing its students to the final goal of liberation, which if you you know is seems to be the goal of it when you sit your first 10-day course. That's the opening uh, purpose that is presented. That is what the intention of this path and practice is about. And yet, I didn't see the supports there for students who had been sitting and serving for many, many years, decades maybe, had been very involved in the organization, were extremely uh, surrendered, or involved, or grateful to the whole practice, and yet they didn't see that they weren't really being supported, and that became a big question, and I felt like there is sort of mixed messages around that. Is this tradition taking students to the final goal of liberation, or is it really a mechanism for just establishing folks, in the Dhamma in an introductory way all around the world? Um, what as I think I mentioned before, I we began to look at the database and see that most majority of students don't come back after the third course. Again, the rationale and the just sort of justification for that is, oh well, the courses are too hard, the retreats are too hard, this is too rigorous a practice, it's their karma. But it wasn't being self-reflective of, oh, what could we do to care for our old students better? What can we do to support our old students once they begin to have these plateaued experiences, or don't feel like they can um, come to an assistant teacher and ask questions about their practice because they're just going to get a sort of a rote answer. And I think that's a piece about what you're speaking to, Joe,
Hmm.
here, in terms of you know what is the mission of SN Goenka's tradition, and I don't think that's. I feel like there are mixed messages around that.
Right. And when you're looking at wanting to fiddle with some things, to look at the retention and want to bring more back, again, this is like a critical engagement in a course offering an organization that is a passive tool in the flow of Dhamma. And so all of these conversations become so much more difficult because you have to know how to speak, and you have to know the methodology and the mindset and the culture of how you're bringing concerns and suggesting changes within that.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I when I started to live in these parallel worlds and to have my foot in two different camps, in the camp of really benefiting and being tremendously grateful, and for the fact that this miracle of this center even exists, while also having my foot in the world of Burma, where I was living for so many years and learning, um, little by little, until it became a crescendo of how much that was being told about the narrative was just simply not true on every level. And I eventually started, when it wasn't able to add up, and when I started to see that I couldn't find a crossover to make it make sense in my head, I started to ask myself, is there a way I can still get the benefit from these teachings without having to interact with the dogma? And even to ask that question kind of floored me. And it's something like, even asking that question probably took years to get to that point, because again, you have the take home message and the way that things really operate versus the way that we're talked about. And to suggest that this organization, which does nothing but speak about the dangers of dogma and the importance of practice over any type of dogma, to suggest in my mind that I wanted to have an experience with practice that was divorced from dogma, even asking that question didn't really make any sense. It was kind of like it took courage to actually admit that there was dogma that was part and parcel of my consistent experience in the organization that I wanted no part in anymore, but I wanted to continue with the practice, which was the thing that was said was central. And I started to explore and investigate. Can I take part in this and really reject, not reject in terms of argue, but reject in terms of like really have nothing to do with and to leave aside all of this dogma and just go into the practice. How does that look? And from the moment when I had that attitude, I remember from the moment I set foot at a center, I was confronted with, and this goes back to you use the expression measuring up in something you said about a half hour ago, where there's this measuring when you were analyzing the gradation of cults and of thought reforms. You talked about one of the measures to look at is, or one of the aspects to look at is how one measures up.
Yeah. That's the currency right there. How many courses have you done? That's a huge currency. And it speaks to, again, organizational culture that puts quantity over quality. There's not there, and this I think goes into even the selection of ATs. It's kind of well known now that if you're sitting a 30-day course, you're being potentially looked at as a potential assistant teacher. And I just feel like there's not a lot that around just looking at the folks' qualities and their maturity um and yeah, this notion of 2 hours a day, one retreat a year, either at least a 10-day, but hopefully more, definitely long course. There's just more and more that kind of then it ends up feeding into a positionality, um, to of status in terms of the organization. What position do you have? Um, and that somehow that quantity of whatever, how long you've been sitting, how many courses, 2 hours a day, uh, gives you more and more positionality in and currency within the organization. um, that I find that troubling, just because it excludes so much more, in terms of people's development, on what is really a developmental process with the path that's much more nuanced than that. That has to do with subtler qualities of how much, just how loving kind are you, how much compassion, just so many other subtle aspects that get overlooked in a process that is kind of quantifying, really, for towards the running the apparatus of running the centers, running courses. There's a huge demand that is ongoing. And there I think the organization is kind of in a kind of um, in an automaton kind of process of just trying to fulfill that need, but without kind of questioning what's getting produced here, and how is it, how are things being measured, um, you know uh, yeah. So that was another kind of piece of this that, um, I just found challenging. I mean, and I found it early on. I mean, when my first trip to India, to Goenkaji's main flagship center, at Dhamagiri, it was incredible. It was incredible to see. It was like, I think, 800 to 1,000 meditators undergoing a 10-day course at one time, and just the logistics of that. right, was phenomenal. I, I kind of heard at one point, just diverge on the story, that like, they'd get, I don't know, whatever, 1,000 applications, and so many hundreds of folks wouldn't show up, and then so many other hundreds of folks would show up on the day of the retreat. And so
Mm,
just the logistics of that, around the world, um, is huge. But I guess I just felt like, the centers were becoming kind of meditation factories, and ATs were being prescribed very kind of canned answers, and the whole thing was like this sort of uncritical conveyor belt, really. Um, and and then when I began to investigate more, it just so many of the tenets, were, yeah, as you say, just simply not true, or just misguided, or just not complete. Not fully true and representative of the Dhamma. And so, um, it's such a mixed thing that I feel around. You know, I really owe where I am at right now in my life to this tradition. I'm established in the Dhamma because of of Goenkaji and this tradition, and yet at some point, it 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 began not to serve me anymore, and that became problematic because I was just so invested,
mm,
and there was so much of myself that, a community, belonging, all those pieces. Um, and yet I had to admit that only part of myself could show up. And yeah, so those are the things that really, I think, I began to just grapple with, and eventually, did lead to my departure. And, I had watched a lot of folks leave the organization and leave the tradition over many years. And I also observed the kind of the cultural response to that, which was a lot of what I perceived as, kind of pity, this sense that, oh, they left the path, they left the pure Dhamma, and this sense of pity on people who were leaving the organization. And so I kind of knew already instinctively, before I was beginning to consider that option, that I knew what what the response was going to be, and that I knew that you can't really leave, when, especially if you're involved as much as I was, you can't really leave the organization with dignity, and
mm,
with a certain amount. It's I mean, there's always loss, of course, when someone leaves any club. There's always a sense of loss, whatever the benign reasons may be. But there's a lot more at stake around this, around how this reflects on your the other teachers. I mean, I've there are folks I worked with for 30 years, sat many retreats with, had many profound discussions with. When I left, they never contacted me, never asked me why. It was eye opening, to have to experience that, and to understand that probably a lot of folks have experienced that when they've decided to leave, for in whatever at whatever level of involvement. And yeah, so yeah.
yeah, and I think that's just segueing into the next topic, which I would suggest as being the next conversation. I think that's really the next natural place to go for the next time we talk, is your decision to leave and the ramifications of it, and what you've gone on to do after, rather than opening that box up now. But before we close this box, there are a couple things I want to add, with leaving, just bookmarking that topic off to the side for a moment, and as we explore it in the next session more fully. As we're talking about some of these concerns, what struck me is that some time ago, a year or two ago, I remember we were having this discussion and just talking about the same things we're talking about now. And one of the insights that he had, at one point, he just laughed and he said, this is, when you think about it, kind of, you zoom out and you look at the landscape, this is kind of absurd, because when you look at the problems that organizations have with, like, breaking the law, massive sex scandals, death, money, exploitation, whatever else. And you yourself said, when these were the first questions you were asked when you spoke to a cult expert, And you had to say, like, really, there's none of these problems that are there. Goenka set up a very ethical organization, and to whatever degree something like this has ever happened, I certainly don't know about it. I've never heard of it. It's pretty clean when it comes to these areas. And remarking that it's just kind of absurd that there is so much focus and so much talk and consternation and concern and argumentation and critical thought about matters which at the end of the day, when you zoom out and don't look at it from within the organization, the Goenka organization, but you just look at the cultural landscape of religious organizations and organizations in general, you just say these things are nothing. Like these issues that we're talking about are so small comparatively to real like controversies and conspiracies and something that bring an organization down and which like brings shame upon its members and leaders and teachers and such. There's nothing like that here. These issues are so small. And yet the converse to Carl's argument, which I should say I think is entirely true and a very good point, but it goes back to this question of what are you allowed to think about? What are you allowed to express concern about? Where are you permitted to be able to discuss and critique and use your critical thought? And for some of the reasons we've mentioned on this conversation, as well as others we probably haven't, there is this hesitancy and this fear, not just to discuss, but to actually think about certain topics critically. And so you have this situation that's so bizarre, really, you have to say, where you have these issues that taken in context and with a wider lens of looking at them are really not that big of that big of issues. And that in that you would think that to be able to that there certainly should be a way to find a way to be able to discuss and proceed with resolving to some degree some of these things, because they're not, they're not things like those other scandals that you simply can't come back from. They're all things that could very much have a resolution and a proper a proper kind of discussion that leaves all parties, satisfied to some level. But because of this sense of being this passive instrument, this tool of the greater Dhamma, and some of the other cultures and take home messages of the organization, because you're just not allowed to even talk about these things, let alone think about them, they become small things that just fester.
Mm. Yeah, and I think there becomes a kind of an obsessive quality to it, especially around the rules and regulations, instead of really looking at, I think, more salient aspects of the Dhamma and having, forums where you're really discussing and getting inspired by the actual Dhamma. There are um, uh, so much of the way the organization operates is a focus on rules and regulations. The last AT meeting I went to, the theme was inviolables, and it was an entire like few days to just devoted to what were the rules without which the organization would no longer survive or exist. And it just, again, it just seemed like just such an obsession with things that, yeah, as you say, at the end of the day, are, they're important, but they're not the rigidity that then comes with all that, which is inevitable, just ends up, I think, um, permeating that culture, and I think that's kind of what's happened, unfortunately. But anyway, I do look forward to continuing this conversation, and especially discussing, yeah, sort of what did lead to my departure, and actually, it wasn't any of these things in the end.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
they certainly played a role, and they certainly a lot of things, but in the end, it wasn't any of this.
Sounds like the perfect radio sounds like the perfect radio teaser to bring back the audience for the next session.
To be continued.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Right, right. Well, we will do so in the next conversation.
All right. Great, Joe. Thank you so much.
Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, We also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam